First, we are entering a dangerous time in Australia where your ability to communicate unimpeded by restrictive laws is steadily being chipped away. The latest attempt to conflate opinions which are deemed bad opinions with misinformation or even disinformation comes from the communication watchdog ACMA that polices speech on channels such as this one.
Well, the federal government is setting its sights on fake news on social media. Under new draft legislation, social media giants could be hit with millions of dollars in fines if they repeatedly fail to take down disinformation and misinformation.
Now, you might be sitting at home and thinking, well, this is a wholly good initiative. Why would we want false information spreading on social media? The problem lies in who is deeming content to be false. In countless cases over the last few years, the fact-checking ecosystem has labelled contested facts as being false in news reporting. It has led to censorship over important discussions such as the origins of COVID-19. Now, fact-checkers deemed it false to suggest that the virus could have escaped a lab. And now we know that that's a very real scenario, and it's widely accepted as a possible cause of the pandemic. Here is our journalist Shari Markson explaining the impact that those fact-checks had on her reporting.
Millions of dollars in fines if the tech giants don't take down disinformation and misinformation. New draft legislation by the Albanese government. Now, we battled with the tech giants and other media outlets to get out our reporting on Wuhan, to keep going even though we were being bullied.
If your reporting doesn't exactly match up with the orthodoxy view on that subject, you risk being labelled a spreader of misinformation, just like Shari Markson was. And this is just one story which should anger you. And who could forget the censorship of a major political story implicating the son of a presidential candidate in the lead up to the 2020 US election? We all know now, retrospectively, that these stories were legitimate, but they share a common theme. They were all labelled misinformation by professional fact-checkers, the same sorts of people who will judge whether social platforms are following the rules. Do you think if a major company like Facebook or Google is facing fines of up to 5% of global turnover, that they will stand up for your freedom of speech? They absolutely will not. So what do politicians outside of the Albanese government think about Labor's attempt to curtail free speech?
So I'm very worried about this because we've seen this creeping censorship come in from the Australian government since coronavirus. We've seen evidence this week in the Senate that the health department here federally conspired to suppress or to try and remove posts by elected members of parliament. This is outrageous, and those posts were just simply criticising government policy. So we have a situation right now, the Australian government is somehow trying to be the policeman of what should be misinformation.
The authority requires the platforms to have rules and procedures about misinformation, and they can decide whether they think those procedures are good enough or not. Now, the risk is that the platforms get worried that they're going to get fined, and so in the process start to self-censor and start to remove a whole lot of content. And some of that content might be content that's controversial, or it might be an unfashionable opinion or whatever it is, but we've just got to be very careful that the legitimate views of Australians on different topics aren't removed from these platforms because it's, potentially at risk of being seen as misinformation.
Fact-checkers are already venturing into policing opinions as well, not just contested facts. The New York Post editorial board wrote this back in 2021, explaining how the big money fact-checking ecosystem was defending lawsuits after publishing false fact checks. Facebook finally admitted the truth. The fact checks that social media use to police what Americans read and watch are just opinion. That's thanks to a lawsuit brought by celebrated journalist John Stossel, which has exposed the left's supposed battle against misinformation as a farce. Now, the left clearly has a stronger grip on institutions, and the danger with fact-checkers turning their gaze to opinions is that one side of politics will have a stranglehold on acceptable discourse. Make no mistake, this move by Labor is one of the most draconian, dangerous and ill-conceived policies we have seen from this government. Right now, they are focused on journalists who don't toe the line. But eventually, no contrary opinion will be safe, no matter who you are. Well, joining me this week is Sky News host Caleb Bond and PR Council Managing Director Christy McSweeney. Caleb, let's start with you. Obviously, nobody wants hateful, completely false, made-up stories to be spreading around. But how do you define what those stories are? Who are the people with this journalistic experience that are going to tell me, an editor, that I'm wrong, that my judgment is wrong?
Well, if you believe where things are going now, pretty much anything can be hateful. I mean, if I say that you look like a man, oh, that's hateful. So the ACMA will have to come in and regulate that as well. The point is that without freedom of speech, you have no other rights. It is the most fundamental right there is, because if you don't have freedom of speech, you can't defend any other freedom. And so any situation where a government comes after that, whether they guise that through misinformation or hate or whatever it might be, is something we should be concerned about. And it's kind of reminiscent of when Labor last tried to do this, which was under the Gillard government. At that time, she was trying to institute what she called a public interest media advocate who would essentially oversee the Press Council, which is a self-regulatory body for the media, so the government could have some control over how the media was regulated. Why would a government want to do that unless they wanted to control the flow of information and the type of information people are receiving? And that's exactly what you see here, just in a different way for the average citizen, as opposed to a media organisation. If they can come after us, they can come after journalists, they can come after you as well.
And they're already starting to do that, Christy. Fact checkers will go after individual punters who are just plumbers and teachers who post stuff on Facebook that fact checkers don't like. They'll write articles about it now. Are you worried about this move?
Look, I think everybody should be worried about the prohibition of free speech or the curtailing of free speech and who adjudicates what is misinformation and what isn't. Some of these things are very, very clear cut, but we see in the body of laws that we have existingly in Australia through a number of actions that have been brought where people have to adjudicate what's harmful to another and what isn't. It is not always very, very clear. The government is trying to pull the reins on the tech industry. I understand that. They're under pressure. They're under a lot of pressure from parents and schools. The current code is a self-authored code by the peak body of the tech industry called Digi, and they want that code to be mandatory. But some of the things in the legislation in terms of going further and further and further are not going to be appropriate for the aim that they're seeking. I think they're going about this at the wrong angle. They should be working with tech companies to combat things such as online social abuse of children, bullying, and various other levers that they have in their power at ACMA to benefit families and kids, rather than have free speech first cab off the rank in trying to tighten up our legislation around social media.
Yeah, Caleb, which makes such a good point. When children are being bullied and then parents are raising issues that the content is staying up there on platforms for days at an end, that's something which should dramatically be made better. These companies make billions of dollars in advertising revenue in our geographic market. But I think that there is also a conflation on Labor's end with that, with cleaning up that very noble pursuit and conflating that with the policing of political opinion.
Yeah, correct. And I have previously argued that social media companies should face the same kind of regulation that the rest of the media does, particularly when it comes to live streaming, for instance, because, and we've seen examples of it, you could go on Facebook or Twitter or wherever and live stream a massacre, for instance. Now, we would never do that at Sky News or any other network because we would face serious consequences for that. You can do that unfettered on social media. You shouldn't be allowed to. But we've already had a window through the self-regulation of social media into how the quote-unquote fact-checkers might look at things. There was an example earlier in the year, I believe it was an advertisement being run by Advance Australia on Facebook, in which they said that the voice to Parliament would divide Australians by race. And that was removed from Facebook by Facebook because that was deemed to be misinformation. How can you argue that
that's exactly what I'm talking about.
They're interpreting what they consider.
Opinion
correct.
On an issue which is of immense public interest to debate.
And do you really want to give that level of power to a government? I understand a private company can decide what they do or don't want published on their platform. They're well within their rights to do that. But do you really want to give that power to a government that can punish you monetarily for what you do or don't do?
Yeah, and Christy, that example that Caleb just drew about, is the voice going to divide Australians by race? Look, some people on the Labor side might argue, no, that's not the purpose and that's not what it will do. But there's a very legitimate argument to be made that it will. It's very hard, I think, to argue that it won't, to be honest. These are the sorts of things that fact checkers want to police. To me, that appears to be policing a political opinion as opposed to a set of facts which are indisputable.
Well, that's politicising critical debate and politicising the opportunity to have critical debate. With social media such the all-prevailing platform of which people debate and speak about issues, and media organisations and advertising firms, public relations companies, all use social media as a tool to encourage people to respond, to seek and further discussion around key critical issues in our public environment, suggesting that a critical debate can't take place because people sitting in a room that call themselves fact checkers, and we have no idea who they are and what their authority is and where they come from, and we have no idea what the dividing lines in their own environment are. That is absolutely stifling the opportunity for people to have a platform that encourages them to have a critical debate on key issues.
It's such a good point. If you don't like someone's argument, formulate a better argument and prove to people why they're wrong. It's just that simple.